My name is Marion Smith, and I'm president of the Common Sense Society here in Washington, D.C. I'm also a graduate fellow at the Heritage Foundation in the B. Kenneth Simon Center for Principles in Politics there, where I read about early U.S. foreign policy history. And so I'm not a completely impartial moderator, but I will strive to be fair tonight, since I've written on this subject before. Just a quick word about the Common Sense Society. It was founded in 2009 by European and American young professionals at that time in Europe, and promotes first principles of liberty and free markets there. This is our first debate event here in Washington, D.C., and here CSS will primarily serve as a debating society about ideas and problems in U.S. foreign policy. We'd like to better understand and promote America's proper role in the world. And thank you all for coming tonight to join us in that endeavor. I should thank the National Review Institute for supporting tonight's event and making it possible. And we're very pleased to have a very distinguished panel with us tonight. Let me quickly let you know the format of tonight's event, and then we will jump right into it. We're going to have opening comments from each of our panelists, about 5 minutes, go around. And then we're going to have a few questions from me, and then some discussion up here among the panelists. And then we're going to take the discussion to the floor with floor speeches, no longer than 3 minutes. Unlike everywhere else around this city where they ask you to turn your speeches into questions, we're going to ask that you turn your questions into speeches. We ask that you try to respond to an argument that's already been made, either here or on the floor, and try to move the discussion forward as best you can. We will be held to high standard of decorum tonight, and I will be the judge of that, so take care. To begin, we're very happy to have the former ambassador to NATO, Kurt Volker, with us tonight. Also glad to have president of the Claremont Institute in California, Brian Kennedy. Very pleased to have Senator Lindsey Graham, Republican from my home state of South Carolina. Very glad to have Benjamin Friedman from the Cato Institute, and also Jamie Fly, who's the founding executive director of the Foreign Policy Initiative here in Washington, D.C. With that, we're going to jump right in. We'll just go, I think, this way around the table. Kurt, 5 minutes.
Okay. Delighted to be here. I had the privilege of speaking at the Common Sense Society in Budapest earlier this year, so now I'm doing it on the U.S. side of the Atlantic. Delighted to do that. One of the questions that Marion circulated to us in advance, which I thought I would take up, is what is the greater danger? U.S. retreat from the world or overextension of U.S. commitments and engagement in the world? And a secondary question was, what is the role of finances in shaping our foreign policy? What can we afford? And so let me answer that question pretty straight up. In my mind, the far greater danger is U.S. retreat. And there's a simple premise. What happens in the world affects the United States, and we would either be out there trying to shape what's affecting us, or it will affect us anyway. And most of the time, the people who are out shaping events when not the United States are people who do not share our interests and do not share our values, and making the world a much more dangerous and volatile place. Now, United States values and interests are inextricably intertwined. You sometimes hear people say that there's a conflict between our values and our interests. We may have our values about freedom and democracy, but we have these other interests. I don't buy that at all. I think that what we instead have is a short-term, long-term problem. In the long run, U.S. interests are always best served by the advancement of freedom and democracy and market economy and rule of law and human rights in the world. The problem is, how do you get there? And sometimes we have to manage difficult situations in order to get there, but we should never lose sight of where our long-term values and interests lie and where that alignment really is. The way the world develops, whether it is in the advancement of those values or away from them, has significant long-term impact on U.S. well-being. And so the investment of the U.S. in our foreign policy is all about trying to shape the development of the world in that long-term direction that benefits us. The key is to have a sound strategy, to exercise leadership while working with allies, and make sure that we have the means to sustain our strategies and policies over time. Not merely throw resources at a problem without a strategy, not get sucked into massive commitments we can't sustain, and not get lulled into a false sense of security by a retreat. We need to recognize that the active promotion of American interests is not a military-only affair. Sometimes that's the image given. But the reality is that we advance our interests in a wide variety of ways: trade, investment, education, rules-based international economic order, civil society, allies, culture, and yes, the military where necessary. And we need to recognize that America is not alone. These values that I talked about are universal values. Dozens of nations around the world are based on these same values and share our values and our interests and want to work together with the United States. And in countries where the leaderships do not share those values and impose their will on their own populations, the people in those countries look to the United States to lead on the basis of those values. So that's the framework then in which you can get to the question, okay, what can we afford? What is the role of finance in this? And so let me ask, can we afford to spend $200 billion a year for the next 10 years in Afghanistan? Probably not. If we had to, we could, but probably not. But can we afford another 9/11? No. If we were to cut the defense budget entirely, take it down to zero, we would still not solve our budget deficit problems at home. So we have to recognize that the defense side is not what's driving the budget problems that we have. And if we did that, if we drove our defense budget to zero, we would suffer far greater costs to our country, our well-being, our economy in the world than what we spend on defense. So the trick is to get it right, to have a sound strategy, sound policies, and sustain them over time. That has often been the challenge because that's really a function of leadership. But good leadership can provide a strong and sustainable and robust foreign and national security policy.
It seems to me the question we're really discussing this evening is to what extent and for what reason are we going to put American soldiers in harm's way? And to put a finer point on it, for what should we spend our treasure, such treasure that is precious these days, and for what should we ask American soldiers to possibly give the last full measure of devotion? Nothing is more simple or more complicated than that. For the last decade, we have asked our soldiers to sacrifice and to die to see that we could bring democracy to Iraq and Afghanistan, to build mosques and schools and hospitals for a people in a far distant land who share neither our beliefs in freedom, self-government, or most essentially, the people who are not part of our social compact and for whose sacrifice precious little will be gained. I don't believe that, while I believe these are universal truths, I don't believe they're universally held. We have removed Saddam Hussein and elements of the Taliban, but we replaced them with rulers that have shown little promise in building free societies and will unlikely be able, once we leave, and leave we will, they will be unable to contain the spread of Islamic terrorism outside their borders. It is a far cry from the sentiment expressed by John Quincy Adams, who said of the United States in 1821, "Wherever the standard of freedom and independence has been or shall be unfurled, there will be her heart, her benedictions, and her prayers be. But she goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy. She is the well-wisher to the freedom and independence of all. She is the champion and vindicator only of her own." But you say to me, the world has changed and we cannot be constrained by outdated notions of our national interest. Yes, the world has changed, but I would say our national interest has not. Our social compact is with the American people and the United States and its Constitution. The purpose of our statecraft must be to defend these peoples and the states and territory of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. It is for we Americans that we sacrifice. What we do must be to actually defend and, when need be, to defeat our enemies, to think of them as enemies, something I think we have not done adequately over these 10 years. On September 11th, militant Islam, as manifest in the terrorists and its supporters and enablers, became the enemy of the United States. Despite invading Iraq and Afghanistan, we did not defeat the cause of militant Islam such that it would have been clear that it would be a bad thing to go around killing Americans. We called Islam a religion of peace and told Americans to go shopping. On September 11th, we tried desperately to believe that we had neither enemies nor that those enemies posed an existential threat to our existence. It was incumbent upon President Bush, and today President Obama, to dissuade us of this folly and to put us in a position of strategic superiority against such enemies. After all, is that not the end of policy, to be better off? After a decade, I think we live with this self-deception and in a state of strategic confusion. Why would we think that we could bring democracy to Iraq and Afghanistan? Both countries adhere to an Islamic faith that does not believe in religious freedom, the cornerstone of any decent democratic order and a free society. A fully functioning democracy in both countries would limit the rights of women and would make subjects of those Christians and Jews that they would permit to live in their midst. We have then been sacrificing for their benefit, it seems to me, not ours. And our consent in Iraq and Afghanistan to their creation of deeply flawed political orders signals to them our fundamental lack of seriousness. Our goal should have been the demoralization of those parts of the Islamic world that seek our destruction. They should have been worse off, and we the better. They should have been consoling themselves about how unfortunate it was that some of their compatriots had decided to attack the United States, and they, those militant Islamists in the Middle East, should be condemned, and that such an attack should never occur again. This we did not do. Despite military victories in Iraq and Afghanistan and our ongoing engagement there, where, let me say, American military forces have demonstrated professionalism and fortitude, the terrible swift sword of American justice was kept in its scabbard, replaced by political correctness and a misguided view of democracy, both ours and theirs. It is one thing to sacrifice the life of an American soldier to defeat an enemy that seeks to destroy us. It's quite another thing to sacrifice an American to improve the lot of someone else's life. We see today the fruits of the Arab Spring, the rise and spread of the Muslim Brotherhood and al-Qaeda throughout northern Africa, especially Egypt, but soon in Libya. The very promise of democracy in Egypt saw the U.S. push Mubarak out the door, and because our NATO allies desired it, we helped overthrow Muammar Gaddafi, who, however loathsome, had been held in check. We've now turned over the industrial infrastructure, which was quite significant, of Libya to a political order led by or substantially influenced by the Muslim Brotherhood, and at minimum, not allied with the United States. Let me say in conclusion that our foreign policy must be guided by prudence, which is never in much abundance. And one cannot simply command prudence, one must be prudent. To that end, we must have a new American strategy than the one we have pursued, built on constitutional principles that we seek the common defense against our enemies abroad and the assurance of our domestic tranquility here at home. A declaration of war and the debate that would have ensued might have been a good place to start after September 11th. This will mean recognizing that as a superpower dedicated to human freedom, we will always have enemies, and these enemies will always seek our destruction. That we must recognize that war is man's permanent state, and that in war it is good, indeed critical, to be the winner. In immediate terms, this means defeating the cause of Islam as a world movement, denying to the Russians and the Chinese this proxy, and caring little for the well-being of anyone but the United States and our true allies. This is a big task, but not one beyond the genius of the American people. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Senator, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. I have to leave at 8:30, and I apologize, but to all the young people who came out on a, what is it, Thursday?
Thursday.
Yeah. Thanks for coming. Thanks for caring. And this is really the country at its best when you're talking about things that matter. And it's kind of, you know, when I go overseas and I say, hello, I'm from the Congress, I'd like to tell you how to run your country. Everybody laughs because they watch C-SPAN. You know, as messy as it is here at home, and it's pretty messy. You agree with that? Pretty dysfunctional place right now. And I'm in a body with 9% approval rating. I tell people I'm a lawyer. The Congress, as a result of being locked down by a lot of special interest politics, about being afraid to reach across the aisle, about 24/7 cable. Can you imagine writing the Constitution today? I think it'd be a great Saturday Night Live skit to have Freedom Hall, Philadelphia, the whole deal, everybody in 1776 garb with satellite trucks outside. And the moment Ben Franklin comes out, Rachel Maddow and Glenn Beck jump all over him and say, "Don't give in." But the bottom line is that democracy is a messy business. And the thing that makes us what we are, I don't believe comes from our religion, because there are so many different religions, even though we're a Judeo-Christian country. A lot of people are not religious at all. You know, being an American is an idea, I think. The question you ask is it the idea exclusive to us? Is it exclusive to one group of people? The idea of, you know, accepting religious differences, taking your fights to the courthouse rather than having militias. I've been to Iraq and Afghanistan a lot, and here's my view. There are a lot of good people over there who want the same thing you want. And there are radical people in the Islamic world that would kill every moderate Muslim, Jew, and Gentile they could get a hold of. And I don't think they represent the majority. So I'm not threatened by Islam. I'm threatened by crazy people. And we have had crazy people in all religions. Now, the Islamic religion needs a reformation. But right now, quite frankly, I'm optimistic that there's a young generation emerging in the Mideast that with the right amount of support and help and guidance can change the Mideast. And the question is, does it matter if the Mideast changes? How many believe it matters? How many believe it's going to change? It's going to change. Now, whether Muslim Brotherhood takes over Egypt, I don't think that's going to happen. There's a strain of radicalism in almost every society. In the 1920s, the KKK marched down the streets of Washington, D.C., thousands of them. You know, I'm a son of the South. In South Carolina, you know, when I didn't attend school with an African American, I was in the 6th grade. So how did all that change? A lot of good people protested and won over the hearts and minds of the people within our country that it has to change. So I don't see a lot of desire in Afghanistan to go back to the Taliban days. Most people I talk to hate these guys. I mean, what a sucky way to live. Anbar province really did reject al-Qaeda. Iraq was a big defeat for al-Qaeda in the sense that Muslims in Iraq turned on al-Qaeda. Having said that, what is the strategy that Lindsey Graham espouses? Is it nation building? Something no conservative can ever say anymore. No, it is providing capacity to will. Where there's will in this world to fight these guys in their backyard and to live in peace with us and to bring about a better life for young women and people in general, it is in our long and short-term national security interest to provide assistance to that will. That's a lot harder than killing bin Laden in many ways. Killing terrorists is part of the mosaic. And I'm associated with being a forward-leaning, kind of hawkish senator. But I understand the limits of military involvement and intervention. You can kill bin Laden, al-Awlaki, you can kill all these guys and they'll be replaced. What eventually causes them to lose is when the people in the region have the ability to say no, have the ability to fight back, have the ability to create a police force that's loyal to the people, not to the dictatorship, a army that will seek to defeat the Taliban and promote democratic governance and submission to civilian authority. That's happening in Iraq, and that's happening in Afghanistan, and the leadership in Afghanistan is very corrupt. 10 or 15 years from now, that will change. For the last decade, there's been a group of young people, military officers, civilians, lawyers, judges, that have seen a different way of doing business in Afghanistan. And the only thing I can tell you from this discussion here is that this struggle against radical Islam, against terrorism, is going to last well beyond my lifetime. And if I'm a South Carolina senator, I could live to be 100. So I've got the long view of this. What can we afford and what we can't afford? Entitlement reform is what's necessary to get us out of debt. You could do away with the entire discretionary budget. It's 35%, going down every day. 53% is Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and interest on the debt. So there is no magic waste program to get rid of. You got to do something with Social Security and Medicare. You could stop every war and dismantle the Defense Department. We're going down the tubes as a nation unless we find a way to be more productive in terms of the tax code and deal with entitlement reform. Democracies, they say, are doomed to fail potentially because we promise ourselves things we can't afford. And people get elected fulfilling those promises. So our domestic problems here at home, we know where why did Willie Sutton rob banks? That's where the money's at. If the super committee does its job, it will do something with entitlements. So I've never bought the idea that the wars are something we can't afford. We need to not send people to war because some of them don't come back. And a lot of them come back really hurt unless you absolutely have to. And the question for me is that what we've done in Iraq, the surge did work. The Sunni Shia Kurd problem is generational. But I do see a breakthrough among young people in Iraq and Afghanistan. They just need the support from within the country and without. And what is the role of the United States? Constitutionally, my job is to defend America against all enemies, foreign and domestic. The problem, I'll end on this thought, is that our enemy is an idea. There are no capitals to conquer. There are no air forces to shoot down. There are no navies to sink. We're fighting an idea, not a place. And we've made plenty of mistakes. But here's the good news. The ideas that we all embrace are so much better than our enemies that even people in the Islamic world, given the chance to choose, are going to come our way. Women are driving in Saudi Arabia. Change is a-coming. Let's embrace it.
Thank you, Senator. Benjamin Friedman, 5 minutes.
Yeah, you might have to cut me off because I'm liable to go on a little too long. So just wave at me, and I'll ignore you. It's an honor for me to be up here with more eminent people all around, especially as the only advocate, really, of the ideology we're supposed to be debating, or at least the only pure advocate. I guess Brian's with me a little bit. But I think, actually the imbalance of opinion and stature up here is indicative of what's going on in Washington for a long time. And we're often told that there's, actually we were just told that there's excessive bickering and partisanship in Washington, which I guess is true. But on this subject, I think the trouble is bipartisan. There's consensus in favor of what I would call militarized global primacy, which wants lots of intervention of various kinds, the two most prominent of which are humanitarian intervention and the long-term kind of interventions we have in places like Western Europe and Asia. So debates going on within the 40-yard lines in this town, and I'm on about the 15. And so what I want to do is talk about why I disagree with the assumptions that underlie this set of ideas, this sort of bipartisan consensus. Before I do that, a couple preliminary points. One, I'm supposed to say how finances should affect our security. I think that's sort of like asking how gravity should affect air travel. I think it's sort of an unavoidable consideration. And certainly our Constitution's preamble says to provide for the common defense, but it doesn't say to do so wastefully. And in a world of limited resources, and there are no other sorts, All goods compete. Whatever you want to do, you're sacrificing something else with the dollars you could have been spending. So we always have to ask how much is enough. Second, some background on my view, where I'm coming from. I call it military restraint, not non-interventionism, because I'm not a pacifist. I'm generally for resisting the temptation to intervene, not exclusively though, so I'm for planning fewer wars, not none. So I call that restraint. I agree with our country's early leaders that continual wars centralize power at home and erode liberty, that alliances are a necessary evil, sometimes likely to pull us into wars remote from our interests, and therefore they should not be permanent, and that we should always, as we already heard, be a friend to liberty abroad, but not its armed vindicator, and that liberty spreads primarily by example. Now that approach dominated U.S. foreign policy for a long time, as you all know. It lost favor as the United States got more powerful and then had more opportunities to intervene abroad. And of course, it lost favor as a result of its association with isolationism prior to World War II. But it remained present in Washington and foreign policy circles throughout the Cold War in the person of people like George Kennan and Hans Morgenthau, who were for balancing the Soviet Union, but not the global Cold War we got. And President Eisenhower largely subscribed to the restraint view, not entirely, but he fought to keep down defense spending for fear that it would erode liberty at home and strangle the economy. He wanted, therefore, to get U.S. troops out of Europe while he was president, or at least shortly thereafter. And he would certainly be for doing so today, and I think as a result, modern Republican leaders would call him an isolationist. Today, restraint lives on primarily among academic realists. It's been sort of exiled from Washington. I'm not mentioning all these people because I think that they would endorse or agree with every word I say, but I'm pointing out that the view I'm taking has a lot of history behind it and a lot of support from people who study this kind of stuff for a living. Now, somebody here, I think sooner or later will say that restraint, what I'm talking about, abandons our ethical responsibilities abroad, but I say no. It follows from what Max Weber called an ethic of responsibility that gives pride of place to possible goods, particularly at home, not dreams that we chase abroad. Somebody might even call what I'm saying isolationist or a retreat from the world, but that too is wrong. It's consistent with free trade, immigration, cultural exchange, and treaties. But that said, I'm with Walter Lippmann, the long-dead famous columnist who once said that he was happy to be called an isolationist compared to the people that thought they could run the world. So what I'm talking about here is stopping trying to run the world with the American military. All right, so let's get to the guts here. What I want to talk about, I'm going to have to be criminally brief. I'm going to say four things, the four sort of insights that underline my departure from the conventional wisdom. One, occupying and trying to fix weak or failed states with ground forces is a generally terrible idea, whether we're fighting terrorists or not. The notion that counterterrorism requires fixing failed states with counterinsurgency misdiagnoses the causes of terrorism and overstates our ability to organize other people's politics. A tiny minority of failed states have provided haven for anti-American terrorists, but the leading example even of this phenomenon, Afghanistan of the 1990s, the trouble was more that the government, the Taliban, allied with al-Qaeda rather than the fact that there was no government. History says instead that terrorism comes largely from political conflicts and from people who are mostly losing them, not disorder per se, and that foreign powers become targets of terrorism largely as a result of participating in those conflicts. We always justify intervention in these sorts of states with comforting, nationalistic, and phony claims that the problems there stem from the inverse of our virtues and are thus corrected by liberalism, by spreading liberalism, or trying to. In doing so, I think we underestimate, ironically, the power of other people's nationalism or related isms that define ethnic or religious identities that are antagonized by foreign occupations and thus motivate people to fight it with violence, including terrorism. And to explain it is not to justify it, but I think that's where terrorism comes from. And for that reason, the history of Western powers attempting forcible state building in poor countries is characterized by bloody futility. Intervention for state building, by the way, as Senator Graham said, or referred to at least, it's a remarkably progressive idea, something that bothers Republicans when the president is a Democrat. If you deny that our government can efficiently deliver the mail, it's odd to insist that it can deliver democracy or even stability to Afghanistan or Mesopotamia just because the delivery man in this case is a soldier. Second, we don't need to defend Europe from nothing, and Japan, South Korea, and others from dangers they can afford to deal with themselves. The Secretary of State said last year that alliances should be in our national DNA, not temporary. But I agree with George Washington, who thought they were a recipe for fighting other people's wars, and you ought to get out of them as soon as their initial purpose is met. We committed to defend these countries when they were weaker than enemies that we thought threatened us. Now they've grown wealthy, and the New Deal was sort of that we agree to defend them and they agree to let us. And I think that it causes a couple problems. They free ride. They spend less than they otherwise would on defense because we're providing it. And since money is fungible, that means we're subsidizing social welfare programs in those places. And by the way, I don't blame our allies for that, just as I don't feel bad about eating the free food I just got from the Common Sense Society. It's our fault. Our military commitments also encourage moral hazard, where our allies engage in reckless behavior because they know we're there to back them up. And you see that in Japan, I think, with leaders going to these this shrine for war criminals. I think you see it to an extent in Israel. You've seen it in the past in Taiwan, and even in places like Georgia that we have not been foolish enough to give a formal commitment to defend to, but they thought maybe they had one and therefore did things that they otherwise might not have. So I think we're providing disincentives for accommodation among neighboring states, not stopping instability. And third, along those lines, contrary to the conventional wisdom, I don't think we provide international stability and guarantee commerce with our overseas bases and naval patrols. It's an incredibly popular idea that I think is wrong. I think it overstates our contribution to stability now and underestimates other states' ability to provide it for themselves in our absence. Neoconservatives, who apparently skipped all of their collegiate history classes except for the day when they talked about September 1938, say that without our support, our allies will despair of the effort to defend themselves and surrender to the nearest anti-American regime. I think leaving aside the question of in what cases that would actually be a security problem for us, the real history is that in international relations, without U.S. military deployments, potential rivals generally achieve a stable balance of power rather than surrender or fight, especially those separated by the sea like Japan and China. So if we go away, the idea that everything erupts into chaos and the earth is consumed in a ball of fire, I just don't think that's going to happen. And we have a lot of history that I could cite to justify it. And I think globalization actually makes it even less necessary to defend trade routes because it gives us supply options. Finally, the dirty secret of our defense politics is that we're pretty safe here in the United States because of wealth, geography, and technology, starting with nuclear weapons, before we send one troop abroad. And what passes for enemies these days are really quite limited compared to what great powers have seen in the past. And I think that's why we hear these more esoteric arguments about primacy so much now. So most of our interventions really, you can argue about the morality of it, and I think we ought to, but I think our security is not really at stake in most of these things. So to conclude, I'll just say that the pro-intervention arguments that I just attacked are more a consequence of global military commitments than their cause. Like most great powers in history, we exercise power where we can, and we call it self-defense or justice. And as our power has grown, these arguments have become more common and therefore more believed, while those like mine and some of these famous people I mentioned in the beginning have been discarded. People on my side tend to say that this state of affairs is unsustainable, but they're wrong. Unsustainable things, to paraphrase Herb Stein, who was a great economist, unsustainable things stop. And our problem is that we remain wealthy and safe enough to go on this way indefinitely, making foreign policy like rich people shop, ignoring costs and benefits, conflating ambition and safety, and treating narcissism as a virtue.
Thank you. Jamie, 5 minutes.
Great, thanks, Marion. Thanks for having me. I must say, until our last colleague spoke, I was a little bit nervous that there might not be anything to, or much to disagree with. As a very proud neoconservative who who actually was mugged by reality, I guess, after his undergraduate years on September 11, 2001, you know, I certainly want to address a lot of the things that were just raised, but I want to get to the point of this question of should non-interventionism guide U.S. foreign policy. And I think Senator Graham already spoke very eloquently about Iraq and Afghanistan. I stole a little bit of my thunder. I just returned from Afghanistan about a week ago. It was my first trip to the country. I'm not receiving funding from the Afghan Tourist Board or the Iraq Tourist Board, but I would certainly encourage all of you at some point to try to get to those two countries, because I've been to Iraq once, Afghanistan once now, and I think it's very difficult to go there to talk to Afghan people who are now newly liberated, to talk to our Marines and soldiers who are putting their lives on the line and making significant gains, especially after the recent surge there, and not come away with a sense of hope. As one of the generals that took us out into one of the most kinetic areas of Kandahar province, where we were very kind of a bruiser, I would say, in the helo on the way out, said to us, you know, the kids will make you realize that we can succeed. And that is the thing, when you go out and you see what our young men and women in uniform are doing on a daily basis, you see the way the Afghan people are realizing that life is better, with Americans providing a true presence, with their Afghan national security forces providing security, that they have opportunities that under the Taliban were only a distant hope. I think that will convince most Americans that our policy, as long as we can stick with it, is the correct one. The experiences I had both in Afghanistan and Iraq last year when I was there brought to my mind a quote from former Secretary of State Powell, who I usually don't even like to quote, but he went through a lot of our recent interventions over the last several decades, through World Wars I, II, Vietnam, Korea, and he said, and when all of these conflicts were over, what did we do? Did we stay and conquer? Did we say, okay, we defeated Germany, now Germany belongs to us. We defeated Japan, so Japan belongs to us. No, what did we do? We built them up, we gave them democratic systems, which they've embraced totally to their soul. And do we ask for any land? No, the only land we ever asked for was enough land to bury our dead, and that is the kind of nation we are. And so the argument I would make, and might be somewhat provocative for some of the speakers, is exactly that. That is the kind of nation we are. We are an interventionist nation, and we just can't escape this fact. Since 1898, Robert Kagan recently wrote in the Weekly Standard earlier this year, we've undertaken 25 overseas interventions, which is roughly one every 4.5 years. And that rate has actually increased since the fall of the Berlin Wall. It's one every 2.5 years. This is interventions by administrations of both political parties. And we've done this because we're the only ones who can. And I really, truly believe that it goes to our core values as the American people. We can't escape this fact, I think, despite all of the problems which a number of the speakers already talked about, the fiscal problems at home, the war fatigue. But we are the kind of nation that leaves places better than we found them. We've done this, and we're doing this in Afghanistan, in Iraq, Libya. We've now given the Libyan people more opportunities. I think the fact that we're even having a discussion right now about whether we even need to think about a policy of non-intervention shows the fatigue in the country. But I think it's really concerning to me 10 years after 9/11, someone who considers himself part of the 9/11 generation, that we're, I think, so quickly forgetting the lessons of 9/11. And the fact that Congress has already enacted significant defense cuts. There are even more significant cuts looming if the super committee does not fulfill its mandate. And I'm really concerned that, that we're going to put at risk a lot of what we've achieved over the last 10 years. I'm also even more concerned about the debate that's breaking out on the right. You kind of expect this from certain quarters on the left, but the fact that conservatives now seem to think that this policy of the last 10 years has been an aberration and somehow not consistent with our history as a nation is personally troubling to me. And I think it's out of step with a lot of our great conservative presidents of recent decades, certainly people like Ronald Reagan. And I would, as someone who served in the Bush administration, put George W. Bush in that category as well, which might be certainly more provocative. I think that, even though I am concerned about this debate on the right, my organization does a lot of work on the Hill and reaching out to new members affiliated with the Tea Party who are not always where I'd like them to be on foreign policy. I do have a lot of hope that in the end we're going to end up coming out of this debate where we have in the past when we've had similar debates about a possible pursuit of an isolationist foreign policy. Because I think if you go back even to our founding fathers, and I know that some people like to cite Washington's entangling alliances, all we need to do is look at the Declaration. And I think all we need to ask ourselves is, does anyone seriously believe that those men who gathered in 1776 in Philadelphia, who faced death if captured by the British, were essentially committing treason, wrote a document that said, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? How can you argue that those words only applied or only meant to imply by our founding fathers to 13 colonies clustered in a far away part of the world and had no application beyond that? I think time and time again our great leaders have made clear that that was not the case, and that these were universal. This was a universal statement, and then it was the role of the U.S. to try to help promote those values whenever possible, at times including military intervention. I'm sure some up here might argue that I'm basically advocating for a non-conservative foreign policy, and I'll readily admit that it's a bipartisan policy that's been pursued by Democratic presidents as well as Republicans, but I think that gets to my point. It's an inherently American foreign policy that we've pursued. We can't escape this destiny despite all of the problems. We remain the world's sole superpower, and with power comes responsibility. It doesn't mean that we need to intervene in every crisis, but I think that we need to understand that wherever possible, when our strategic interests align with our moral interests, as they often do, we have a responsibility to act. And when we don't act, we get some of the results that we're seeing right now. We see this in the Middle East as the Syrian people are trying to rise up against Bashar al-Assad, and they get little more than words from the president. And we have other people stepping in to fill the void. We have the Turks and Saudis and others who may not always share our interests, trying to fill that space and trying to pursue policies. We have the Iranian people that we have done very little to help and who've tried to rise up against their tyrannical rulers. And we have the Afghan people, back where I started, who now face a question of whether the U.S. is going to be standing by them after 2014 and whether they are going to be able to consolidate these gains that they've made against the Taliban. I'll end by just saying I'm not always convinced that that eloquence is an American trait, but I think it certainly is a British one. So one of my favorite quotes that talks about why this is inherently something, this sort of interventionist foreign policy that America needs to pursue, comes from Tony Blair, who spoke to a joint session of Congress in 2003, talking about Iraq, but also the war on terror and U.S. interests. He said, in some small corner of this vast country, out in Nevada or Idaho, where these places I've never been to but always wanted to go, I know out there that there's a guy getting on with his life, perfectly happy, minding his own business, saying to you, the political leaders of this country, why me and why us and why America? And the only answer is because destiny put you in this place in history, in this moment in time, and the task is yours to do. I think as conservatives, if we think that, and we believe in American exceptionalism, and many of us have been concerned about President Obama's apparent disregard for this concept, how can we believe that this task is not ours to do? Does American exceptionalism mean that we are so unique that the values espoused by our founding fathers and our leaders in the past and maintained and defended by the blood of Americans of generations past only apply to one society, one religion, or one religious tradition in one part of the world at a particular time? I, as many people here, are probably concerned about Obama's foreign policy. And like most Americans, I don't want to see endless war. I don't want the Americans of my children's generation to be building the empires of the mind, or I would like them to be building the empires of the mind that Reagan spoke about, rather than patrolling the Hindu Kush like the soldiers I spent time with recently in Afghanistan. But if our national security demands it, I think that's what we need to do. And I'm confident that our leaders, like their predecessors over the last century, will ensure that we continue to accept that task and to intervene when necessary.
Senator Graham, you said on Fox News Sunday last week to the Republican Party, and I quote, "National security matters, step up on it," end quote. Are you concerned that in the midst of ambiguity over our foreign policy or a grand strategy, if one can speak of it that way, that the easiest thing is sort of withdrawal? What are the dangers if we do that? Is that what you mean by isolationism?
Well, you know, the party, there's always been a libertarian movement in the country. That's been part of our political mosaic for a long time. They mostly align with Republicans, and you're welcome. Please join us. We need coalitions. Sometimes I guess they go their own way and have independent candidates for president. But what I see in the Republican Party, quite frankly, is encouraging in the last few months. As President Obama talks about leaving Iraq without any follow-on force, because the Iraqis would not agree to immunity for our troops, I think a lot of our folks are saying, wait a minute, our military commander said we needed 14 to 18,000 as a following force. They have no Air Force. They have no intelligence gathering capability. The Kurd-Arab dispute needs to be refereed for a while to come. So there's a reason that we need military troops. He's the commander-in-chief. I don't buy the idea, quite frankly, that that was an insurmountable hurdle. And Jay Carney said something somebody told me about today, I guess, that yes, he was involved, President Obama, when he was accused of not being involved. He was involved in fulfilling his campaign promise of getting out in 2008. Well, you know, I understand campaign promises. I understand being war weary, but here's what I'm looking for from a Republican Party. We live in dangerous times. How many people believe if the Iranians get a nuclear weapon, that they want a nuclear weapon? Okay? That they're headed toward getting a nuclear weapon. That would be bad. Okay? Now, how to stop it is difficult. So our Republican Party needs to be talking about what is our view of when you intervene and what is an adequate defense budget. Can you reduce defense spending? Yes. I'm willing to try to reduce defense spending over the next decade by up to $400 billion by making it a more efficient organization. I am not willing to cut it by $1 trillion by pulling the triggers on the super committee. So count me in for reforming better business practices. I want my party to say that. I don't want us to be the party that says we're completely broke. You got to do everything except touch defense. So what I see emerging on the Republican side among the main contenders now, Ron Paul is consistent for 30 years. I don't have a problem with Ron Paul because he believes what he believes, and he's not going to win. The marketplace of ideas are going to make this all work out. What I don't want to lose as a party is the view that national defense is the most important thing we do at the federal level. It's the first thing we do at the federal level, and it should be scrutinized like any other part of the budget. Now, back to the war. When are we at war? And if so, with who? And how does Iraq and Iran, what did Saddam have to do with al-Qaeda? Really nothing, quite frankly. Saddam Hussein presented a different kind of threat. The weapons of mass destruction argument, the intelligence didn't seem to support that. So at the end of the day, we go into Iraq, we replace a dictatorship, and we screwed up big time because we didn't understand that when the dictator leaves, vacuums are filled and security matters. But where did al-Qaeda go? They went into Iraq right behind us because a real threat to the al-Qaeda movement, in my view, is democracy, representative government, where a woman can have a say about her children. You can actually have a discussion, you can dance, you can sing. You can do things they don't want people to do. So the fact that they went to Iraq and were defeated by Muslims in Iraq is encouraging to me. I just want to leave you with some encouragement. I've been to Iraq and Afghanistan about 20 times. I met lawyers and judges who've been killed in the process of trying to change their country. Rather than retreating and giving up, many of them, their sons and sometimes their daughters, have taken over. I'm bullish on the idea that the agenda that we're fighting, radical Islam, as expressed through the Taliban and al-Qaeda, doesn't have much of a market appeal. The only time it survives and flourishes is through intimidation, when those who could say no or would say no can't say no. So is that intervention? Is that nation building? Call it what you like. I think it's in our interest to make sure that whatever spots on the planet this ideology emerges in any real strength is to go in there and try to contain it, try to help those people who fight these guys in their backyard be able to fight. So what I want from the Republican candidate for president is to say that I want to come home from Afghanistan too, but I don't want to ever have to go back. And if it means in 2014 having 4 air bases that would give the military edge to the Afghan security forces in perpetuity against the Taliban, if it means having special forces left behind in the 20,000 range total, I'm willing to do that because I know if I do that, that this young generation that you're talking about will always have the edge over the Taliban, and I think that matters to us. That's what I want the Republican nominee for president to talk about. And finally, here's what I want the Republican nominee for president to talk about. That if Iran got a nuclear weapon, it would change life as we know it to the point that that is a non-starter. Now, if you attack Iran, if sanctions fail, if the Russians and the Chinese would help us in a serious way, I think sanctions could actually work. In 2009, there was a moment. There was a moment where the people who live in Iran said, you know, I don't like this. Well, that moment passed temporarily. The regime killed its way back into stability, but it is a house of cards that's going to fall one day. And I want to shape the world within reason, because it is going to change. Vacuums are going to be created, and how those vacuums are filled in, the Republican nominee for president needs to tell us that when it comes to Iran, I will try sanctions, I will push sanctions, I will hope and pray they work. But I'm not going to let the Iranians, without one hell of a fight, get a nuclear weapon that could throw the world into chaos. And that means at this point, military intervention will not be surgical. You don't need ground forces. But if you attacked Iran tomorrow to destroy their capability of developing a nuclear weapon, because their systems are so redundant, it wouldn't last 1 or 2 days, it'd take a while. You don't need one ground force to do it, but you'd have to destroy their army the best you could, punish the Republican Guard, sink the small navy they've got, and shoot down their old Air Force. And they would shoot rockets and missiles at our bases in the Mideast. And you would open up Pandora's box for a while. There'd be suicide bombing teams hit us. And the world would be very unstable for a while if they get a nuclear weapon. In my view, you empty Pandora's box. That's the decisions of our time. Not really good ones, are they? But I do believe that if we stay involved in a smart way, like this gentleman on the end said, and understand that what happens in Afghanistan does matter to us, and we learned that the hard way, that we're going to win this thing. And people ask me, what is winning? What is winning the war on terror? How do you know you won? There's not going to be a surrender ceremony. There'll be a day, and it's a ways off, trust me, where we can start reducing our footprint, stop spending our money on not only military intervention, but hospitals and wells and schools, things that we need here at home. We're flat broke. I'm a Republican supporting the Foreign Ops appropriations bill. That's about as popular as a toothache. $44 billion, 1/2 of 1%. And it's easy in this world we live in for Republicans to say, let's just get rid of foreign aid. Well, if you get rid of the ability to help people through the civilian side, then the only thing you got left is to leave or bomb them. And I want more tools than that. So count me in the Ronald Reagan camp of wanting to shape the world in a smart way. So I hope and pray that my Republican Party will embrace the idea that we are the leader of the free world, and that leading from behind is not an option for this country. That we're not there in Afghanistan, Iraq, or other places to impose our will. We're there to create a situation for those who have the will to live in peace with us, that they can accomplish their goal, which is to have a better life in a more friendly fashion. Killing terrorists is important. Helping those who would live in peace with us and fight back in their own backyard is the key to permanent security. It costs more, it's bloodier, and it's more difficult to explain. But the payoff is enormous. To the Republican Party, please understand it is not enough to criticize President Obama. You have to have a vision. And I am more optimistic than ever that our candidates in the top tier are beginning to sense that America's destiny, as Ronald Reagan and others have described it, Republican and Democrat, is good politics. Thank y'all for having me.
I would pick up right where Senator Graham left off and say that you do need to have a vision of the world that we want to live in, because it's going to be changing, it's going to be affecting us, and we can shape it, and we have an interest in trying to shape it because it will be better for us if we successfully do that. Then you also, and this is a point Ben made, you have limited resources. There is no such thing as unlimited resources. So you have to make choices about what are the best ways to go about that. And this isn't something you can accomplish in terms of shaping developments in a once and done. And you can't do it in a short space of time. You have to position yourself to be able to advance your interests over a long period of time. So I do think that you need to look at the challenges and look at your resources and then make reasonable choices about what you can and what you can't do, but still driving in the same direction. I think there are some fallacies involved in thinking that if we are not actively engaged, then what happens in the rest of the world or how they deal with each other doesn't really affect us. I think it really does affect us. And I think there's also a fallacy involved in saying that, well, by engaging, we are trying to impose and direct through our military what others do. I think that's also wrong. I think the nature of the challenges in the world really boil down to a fundamental principle, which is the relationship between people and the people that rule. This is a age-old thing of human history, but our society was based on the idea that societies are best when it's the people who choose the government to rule over them rather than the government that rules over the people without their having a say in that. What you see in other parts of the world, and another fallacy, is to write off whether it's Muslims or whether it's Arabs or whether it's Afghans as a group and saying, well, they don't like this or they don't believe that, or we're trying to impose a different view on them. There's pluralism out there. And as we've seen in Afghanistan, Iraq, the Middle East now, the majority of people are not extremists, and they are not comfortable with having others impose their regimes and their ideology on them. They want to claim their own future very much as people around the world do. So what I think our function is in applying resources that we can afford to our interests abroad is to try to create the space and the time for people to improve their own situations. We can be helpful, but we can't do it for them.
Benjamin?
Well, if you can point me to these people who say the world doesn't affect us at all, I'd love to meet them, because I've never met a single person who thinks that. I mean, the question is, how does it affect us, and is it worth it for us to do X or Y in response to how it affects us? So that it's just sort of a straw man to go argue against the people who say we have no part in the world. I mean, that's certainly not my position. There's nobody up here saying that. I mean, I thought we were talking about when the use of force is a good idea, not, does the United States have trade and diplomacy and so forth. Look, there's this myth that politics stops at the water's edge, and there's this thing called electoral politics and this thing called defense strategy, and then there's a third thing called the budget. None of that is true. I mean, as I agree that this is a democracy, and you want to live in a country where decisions about foreign policy and defense have nothing to do with electoral politics, that's called a dictatorship. When Senator Graham referred to Barack Obama fulfilling his campaign promise to get out of Iraq. Good. I mean, he has to get elected. I mean, we have democratic political processes to make decisions because they're important, not because they're not. We have technocrats and civil servants to do certain things, but the more important, more contentious things, we have a political process to make decisions about. So, okay. And then on the budget piece, my argument is, look, I used to repeat the myth that what we really need to do is have a more restrained strategy, and then we can use that to cut the defense budget. And I think that would be terrific. I would love to see us make some choices about all the stuff we're doing, which are the best investments, and have a panel of smart people come up with the recommendations and then have it be enacted. But it's never going to happen. The way you get restraint, the way you get hard decisions is when people don't have enough money to do all the things they want to do, and then they have to actually think about, should I do X or Y? And that only comes with some budgetary restraint. So I think it sort of has to work that way. It works that way in people's personal life. You know, the article that you referred to, which I wish it was in the real Foreign Affairs, by the way, it was foreignaffairs.com.
Ah, I see.
The title was in part, you know, austerity is the best auditor. And I think, you know, nobody really, you know, you want a good auditor, go broke, you know, and then you'll really figure out what it is you can sacrifice. And just finally on that point, you know, people are saying, well, okay, it's entitlements that are really driving the deficit. Sure, but that's like saying if you went broke and then you're going out to an expensive dinner on a credit card, well, it's not really dinner that made me broke, it's my mortgage. I mean, you know, you go broke a million different ways, right? I mean, everything counts. So I think that's sort of a false dichotomy.
Right, thanks. And just all of you, feel free to jump in if anything interests you that you want to speak on. We'll try to make this move along a little faster.
Well, I got about 3 pages worth of response
well, we're not
to
get all
everything
to
Lindsey
it,
Graham just said.
I'm afraid.
Although I thought I was bringing him around before he left. I mean, you know.
Benjamin, let me just ask you, if we do end up pulling out of Afghanistan fairly soon, is it time to go?
Well, it was time to go a while ago. I mean, I'm
right.
for,
okay, no, that was a quick answer.
I'm for leaving some special forces and drones, not 100% out.
We're talking about a few things. One is security concerns, and then the other, which Jamie touched on a little bit, is this idea of maybe American leadership abroad and exactly what that means, our values or our principles. You had a quote from the Declaration of Independence and was talking about American exceptionalism. My question to you, because you seem to indicate that in the Arab world they may not want to share those principles. Is the Arab Spring, to your mind, motivated by some of the same ideas that motivated the American founders to draft the Declaration?
No. Look, I mean, part of this seems like optimism parading as policy. It'd be great if they all became Junior League Democrats and they believed in the rights of man and they had religious freedom and all of that. They don't believe that. They're not motivated by those things. I mean, how do we know in Libya and Egypt that most of what was not organized by the Muslim Brotherhood or some other like force in order to replace a secular regime in both countries with a dictatorship by a Muslim Brotherhood eventually, maybe not overnight, but we have very little to suggest that these people believe in democracy or freedom. And so in that regard, even though we hope for those things, we haven't been able to achieve that in Iraq for all the gains we've made there. We haven't been able to achieve that in Afghanistan, beyond all the people we've killed there. Why do we think we're going to be able to make the world a better place because we go there? Why was it not sufficient to go into Iraq and replace Saddam and leave it to them to establish their own country and let them know that if they ever built a regime that would harbor terrorists or sponsor terrorism against us, we would be back? Why did we think it was proper to spend the lives of the American people, American soldiers, to try to create for them a better life? Just fundamentally, I don't understand that. And by the way, when you talk to the American people, I live out in California, when you go to even crazy California, the average person will think, right to go to Iraq, right to go to Afghanistan, why did we stay? We may have universal principles applicable to all men at all times, but these people don't seem to be adopting those. And they do look at Islam, by the way. And Senator Graham said he wasn't worried about Islam. Well, I think he should be. One can read the Quran and read the most violent parts of it, and they say you cannot be friends with the Christian or the Jew. And ultimately, they do believe in establishing a worldwide caliphate. Now, we may dismiss that as just, wild dreams by 1.3 billion people, or a small segment of those 1.3 billion people. But the people who are in the leadership of those countries, they may be a minority, but they're an organized minority, and they will dominate an unorganized majority. And I think we'll see that in Egypt, and I think we'll see it in Libya, and we will get out of Iraq because we are tired of being in Iraq because no one thinks we ought to stay to turn them into Democrats. And so when we leave, they will become much like they would have been had we not stayed after getting rid of Saddam. And I think the same is true of Afghanistan.
But I mean, of course, we went to Afghanistan and Iraq primarily for security reasons, even though the reasons given may have been a little more muddled than we would have liked. And so there is a parallel, which Jamie highlighted as well, with Germany and Japan. What if we had just left then? Jamie, what do you think Afghanistan would look like right now if we pulled out?
Well, I think going back to what Brian said, I mean, I think the funny thing is we actually kind of pursued Brian's proposed strategy in both Iraq and Afghanistan. That's why we're still there. The Bush administration, and I've proudly served in the second term of the Bush administration, but the Bush administration did not have a coherent, agreed-upon approach. You had people, Secretary Rumsfeld and others I respect, but who did believe we should go into both Iraq and Afghanistan and get out as quickly as possible. And that's why we tried to rely on surrogates. We tried to build up local power, and it was a disaster. We didn't have enough troops to provide basic security to allow these fledgling leaders to start moving the countries forward. And then to fix the situation, we had to do the surge in Iraq, and we've now had to do a surge in Afghanistan. So it's not that we had this grand democratic experience from day one. I wish it was true, and I think if that was the case, we probably wouldn't be in either country right now.
Well, Colin Powell said, you break it, you fix it. It was his idea to want to stay, right? Rumsfeld, left to his own devices, I think, would have gotten rid of Saddam and then left.
But unfortunately, Colin Powell was not determining the troop levels.
No, George Bush was. No, I mean,
on the recommendations of the Pentagon, yeah.
Fine, but ultimately the Bush administration said, we're going to stay. And by the second administration, and again, all praise to George Bush for doing many good things, but by the second administration, fighting in Iraq had turned into the Democracy Project, by their own account. And so I would ask you, Jamie, why stay? Was the Democracy Project really worth it? I think you believe it is. I just don't see why we're so confident. And I think the fatigue that you point to, I think Americans just look at what's going on. They read the paper every day. They'll go fight and die anywhere for freedom and to defend each other. But to turn those people into Democrats, and by those people, I simply mean people who don't seem to be well-suited for democracy, again, because they don't respect the rights of man. Some people may certainly desire those things, but as a civilization, we know we've been working on democracy here since Magna Carta in England. It takes a lot to get this right. Why did we think we were going to be able to do that in so short a period of time? And if President Bush really thought it was absolutely necessary, he might have told the American people, this may take 100 years. And you better condition yourselves now, this may take 100 years. But in a way, it all seemed too easy. And everything, every week, every month, there was a new turn, a new surge, a new this or that. That's my problem with it.
I accept all the mistakes that were made. I mean, I guess you mentioned kind of an unrealistic optimism. I'll proudly say I'm very optimistic about Iraq's future, despite the president's recent announcement. We do have a fledgling democracy in Iraq. And the reason to stay now, our role there was not to prop up a democracy. It was for broader strategic concerns. We have Iran right next door to Iraq, which is meddling in Iraqi politics. It has nothing to do with whether democracy has really taken hold. Iraq is under all kinds of pressure from its neighbors who have their own interests. And so the problem with what President Obama just announced is because, again, it has nothing to do with the democratic experiment underway in Iraq. It's because we have broader strategic concerns that make sense for us to have bases in Iraq, given potential future conflict with Iran. It's the same issue with Afghanistan. Afghanistan is leagues behind Iraq in terms of its democratic development, and I'm less optimistic about the future of Afghanistan just given the fatigue in the country right now. But we have strategic concerns to be there regardless of whether you care about whether we're trying to build a democracy. Pakistan next door with its nuclear arsenal, providing safe havens for terrorists who are plotting literally to carry out attacks in this city right now. And so I understand the frustration, the fatigue, the lack of perhaps confidence in the Afghan and Iraqi people to be able to take hold of democracy. But I think as Senator Graham spoke about, the only way to make sure that we're not drawn back into these places is to leave something better behind. I'm all for killing terrorists. I'm all for the CT approaches we're pursuing in Pakistan and Yemen and Somalia right now. But we need to give people something else than a Hellfire missile into the house next door. I mean, that only goes so far. And we can do that for the next 100 years, but we're going to quickly run into our friends at Cato starting to complain about the cost of doing that as well. And it's not going to be addressing the long-term problems. And so I think, yes, the Bush administration made some serious mistakes, but I think in the end they realized that if they were going to get these interventions right, that they needed to provide the resources and we needed to have some sort of staying power. And they probably did not adequately explain that to the American people. But I think in the end,
hence the fatigue.
Yes, and our moral and strategic interests, I think, were intertwined, though.
Yeah, Marion, I just have to raise one issue because it's reacting to something that you said, which is anytime you hear anyone say those people, a big red flag should go off. Any more than you would, you can't say them, the Iraqis, or any more than you can say the Americans, or the Christians, or the Jews, or any. It's just condescending and wrong to think of people that way. That's not the way people are. People are diverse and pluralistic and have a lot of different beliefs. Certainly, there are people in Iraq who are bloodthirsty extremists and intent on killing each other, and they've spiraled themselves up into sectarian warfare. That still doesn't represent the majority of the people or what they want out of Iraq. And I think when you look at the Arab Spring, you say, well, what do they want? Well, all you have to do is listen to what they say they've wanted. And especially in Tunisia, I think they were extremely eloquent in putting out a list of demands that would have paralleled anything you would have gotten here in the 1700s. The trick is whether they can successfully bring that about, because there are people in Tunisia who are Islamist extremists who don't want to see that succeed in their society. There are people who would like to reestablish a dictatorship. But I've had a chance to meet with people from the, it's strangely named, the Council or the Committee on the Implementation of the Objectives of the Revolution is the Tunisian group, or some of the activists in Egypt who were the ones who were organizing the protests in Tahrir Square in terms of getting people out for the right things. They're not directed by anything other than their own motivation to see change in their own society. Granted, it's risky. It's very risky. But that's why I come out very much on the side saying, therefore, we have a stake in trying to help create some space and some support for those sorts of people to really be able to shape their societies.
Thanks. You have anything you want to say? We need to move it to the floor. Let me just say really quickly. Let me just say real quickly that foreign policy debates are a good thing because that's how we can reach, I think, a more prudent foreign policy. And we may seem like we're all over the board here and may not agree on much, but I'll just remind you that in the Virginia Ratification Convention, Patrick Henry got up and said, "We have nothing to fear from Europe forever because of the Atlantic Ocean." He must have forgotten how the British troops had gotten to America just a few years before. James Madison responded, and nowhere near the speaker that Patrick Henry was, and he said, "If we shall be free at home, we will be respected abroad." And he was arguing for the provisions in the Constitution for an army, for a navy, et cetera, et cetera. We have roaming mics, and you are limited to 3 minutes, and we just ask that you not ask a question. You make a short speech, make an argument, and I already see them. Yeah. Right down here. We'll start with you in there. 3 minutes.
All right.
And please identify yourself if you mind.
All right, my name is Blake Gober, and I very much so side on the side of Senator Graham. And even though I greatly respect Mr. Friedman, and you are much brighter on this subject than I would ever be, however, having been to both Iraq and Afghanistan for 7 months apiece to each country, I noticed, just like you noticed, that the people of those countries, they are on our side. The most brave people I've ever met serve in the Afghan army because every day they face the Taliban coming to their homes, coming to their family. The vast majority of the people that we worked with, and where I was at, it wasn't necessarily a combat style of an occupation, if you would. It was more of we were there on security and helping train the Afghan army and helping train the Iraqi army. It was more so along those lines. We saw just how powerful and how much they thirst for what we have in America. They thirst for the opportunity to go down to the street, to the marketplace every day, and they thirst for the opportunity to do it without fear of an explosion. I would dare say that less than 10% of the people over there are against us. Less than 10% of the people over there side with the extremists, and they are extremists. And even though I wholeheartedly disagree with what the Quran says and, you know, kill the infidel and all that kind of stuff. I would say the majority of Muslims do as well. What we face a lot, and the fact that I'm very much so a non-isolationist, and is the fact that what's more important to us right now is our economy, and we live in a global economy. The global economy is one where every time that Greece has to get bailed out, or every time that the Iranians say that they're getting closer to a weapon, our markets react. And until we want America to no longer be in a place where we're in a leadership role, we're going to have to take care of those responsibilities, and those are our interests. And it is the job of the government, it is the job of the military to protect our interests at home and abroad.
Right. Thank you. Very good.
Greece. You want to invade Greece? I mean, they got a debt problem.
We can take Greece, I think.
That's not a military problem.
I don't know. We can take them.
And look, there's a lot of. I have no doubt that there's a lot of nice people in Afghanistan who want to live well. And people keep saying, is it going well in Afghanistan? What do they want this? How's it would look if we weren't there? The question is it worth it? Is what we're doing worth it? It's a cost-benefit analysis, and you can put some justice and morality in the equation. But I get very tired in D.C. of hearing these scorecards on how things are going without any attempt to say, well, is it worth it to the United States to be there? And we're talking about intervention. That's the big question that people aren't talking about. I'm hearing a lot here of what I refer to as the incompetence dodge. With Senator Graham in particular, everything would have been fine in Iraq if we would have, had better counterinsurgency doctrine. And I think there's a lot of evidence that that's not true. We do not have the wisdom and power to reorganize people's politics that well in places like that. And you can do better or worse, but it's going to be a bloody, difficult process. And the answer is don't go. I mean, Senator Graham said, we went into Iraq, we did a bad job, it was chaotic, so Al-Qaeda came. They weren't there before, but then they were killed by fellow Muslims. So he wants to do that again? I mean, that's his strategy for counterterrorism, have a big bloody occupational mess. Hopefully the terrorists will come. There are simpler ways to do it.
All right. And, we can't have a point-by-point rebuttal to the senator, but go ahead, 3 minutes.
Hi, I'm Jack Hunter. I'm the Director of Outreach for Young Americans for Liberty. I'm from the most military-heavy state in the Union, which is Lindsey Graham State, South Carolina. Right. Good to see you, Marion, fellow South Carolinian. I speak to soldiers all the time, just like this gentleman that just spoke. I spoke to somebody yesterday who was an Afghanistan veteran, and he wanted me to know that most of the Afghanis didn't even know what 9/11 was. A lot of them thought that the U.S. soldiers were Soviets. These are people who don't have TVs. They are not informed like we are. For every soldier you talk to who thinks it's worth it, you'll talk to another one that says the exact absolute thing. CBS News poll recently said that 1 in 3 Afghanistan and Iraq veterans say that both wars were not worth it. A Pew Research poll, wrap your head around this, 51% of the veterans in Iraq and Afghanistan say that the things we do overseas cause more terrorism. 51%. That's your blowback theory. It's supposedly crazy, and Senator Graham attributes to crazy libertarians like Ron Paul, which is he was alluding to. 51% of our troops think the same thing. Now, what I want to talk about before my time runs out, this idea of what's conservative and what's libertarian. At the end of his life, George Will asked William F. Buckley, did you think the war in Iraq, this Wilsonian language about making the world safe for democracy, is this conservatism? Bill Buckley said it's absolutely not. It's anything but conservatism. Now, did Bill Buckley and George Will have some sort of crazy libertarian moment? Or is there something in the American conservative movement that runs much deeper? People like Russell Kirk and Richard Weaver and Robert Nesbitt and National Review, these great conservative minds who have foreign policy views closer to what libertarians like Mr. Friedman might believe. There is a deep-running philosophy on the right in the conservative movement that is non-libertarian, that does not think it's prudent to be the policeman of the world. That is unadulterated neoconservatism, and that it has sort of dominated our foreign policy in the Republican Party for 20 years doesn't make it any more conservative. It is liberalism turned on its head and passed off as conservatism, in my opinion.
Thank you. All right, right here.
mic over to me. My name is JP Frere. I am by no means a neocon, but I love it whenever the neocon straw man is brought up, because it's always the most nefarious group of people that have ever done anything to American foreign policy ever done.
Jamie.
But before I jump into this, I will also express why I'm not a proper neocon. Just really quickly, you know, I don't. There are all kinds of flaws with me, I know, but to start with, the idea that, as you expressed, and I agree with it, that there are certainly problems with pluralism in Afghanistan. If you go to your typical poor working class village, you're not going to be running across a whole lot of people that really have high opinions of Jews. You're just not going to run across them. Same thing goes for Iraq. But that said, I find that for all of the economic knowledge and strength of the libertarian position, it finds itself woefully historically ignorant. If you look at, you know, and I'm not talking about the discussion about percentage of GDP in terms of defense spending. I mean, I would expect that, you know, that would wind up drawing back, but as a consequence of the federal government prioritizing other ridiculous things that we don't really need and not prioritizing defense spending, I don't think that defense spending should be higher. I just think that the pie should be smaller, and that the slice of the pie that the defense budget gets should be pretty large. I just lost my thread, beg your pardon. But it finds itself historically ignorant, because if you look at all of the people that committed ideas to paper about the importance of liberty and freedom, and you saw what they did as soon as they became president, you then get a different idea as to how foreign policy was constructed as a part of the American tradition. American politics relies on a strong foreign policy nationally. It is not something that you can reduce to a National Guard the way that Alan Keyes would want to do it. It is not the way that it is not a fully explored version of this anti-Wilsonian idea that you had mentioned George Will and Buckley sharing some brandy over, because it was Buckley who had decided that James Burnham was the guy that he was going to side with at National Review, and not Russell Kirk. That American conservatism relies on a strong foreign defense, and that is why conservatism is the more dominant and realistic philosophy governing America, and not libertarianism. And I sympathize with libertarianism a great deal. I just think that it's wholly unrealistic to say that if we pulled out of Iraq right now, if we never got involved in there in the first place, despite the threat of weapons of mass destruction being there, I just don't see that as a particularly realistic thing.
Thanks. Right here in the back. Just take it around.
Thank you. Yeah, sorry. My name is Sam Shirazi, and I guess what I wanted to talk about was, obviously this is an American crowd, and I consider myself a proud American. But at the same time, I was born in Iran, and I have family in Iran, friends in Iran. And gentlemen mentioned those people, and you know, I just wanted to give a little perspective. At least from my understanding, a lot of people in Iran want to be friends with the United States, want freedom, want democracy. It might not be the exact same thing we think of, but you know, 90% the same. And so in that sense, I would like, you know, the U.S. to, you know, speak out against the regime when it's committing human rights violations, to support the Iranian people's will and what they want to do with their country. I just wanted to warn or give a little bit of context that, I mean, I knew a guy who, he's actually started studying right now at Princeton, a really smart guy, and really pro-American Iranian, you know, doesn't, you know, hates the regime, not very religious. But, I mean, he told me if the United States or any country attacked Iran, and even if it was to get rid of the regime and put up a democratic regime, in all likelihood, he would consider going and, you know, fighting against the foreign country. I mean, so I think this idea that we'll be greeted as liberators, even in countries, even among people who really support our idea of freedom and democracy, I think there's just a natural instinct to always be against people who are coming into your country. So, you know, I understand that some people would support it within those countries, and there are instances like in Libya where the people wanted us to come in, and I think it makes sense for the U.S. to get involved. But I think we should listen to people on the ground. If you know, we want to go into Iran to help the Iranians, we should listen to see if they actually want us to go in. Same thing in Syria. I understand we might have to go to war with Iran or attack Iran, maybe because of the nuclear issue, and that's a different thing. But if we're saying we're going in on behalf of those people, I think we should try to listen to the people. And I think maybe Libya, you can argue, was successful because the people wanted us to come in, and something like Iraq was not as successful because the people initially didn't ask us to come in and liberate them. So I would just say, as you know, obviously this is a topic of American foreign policy, I think we should keep in mind that these are people in this in those countries who have opinions of their own, and sometimes they would want the U.S. to come in, sometimes they wouldn't. And so I think we have to keep that in mind, that there's something we want to do in the world, but you know, we have to keep in mind that the people in those countries might not always want us to do something.
Right. Any responses up here? Any of this?
The problem with that, though, is what are we going to poll those people to see what they want done? That would be a hard thing to do. I know a lot of Iranians, right? A lot of them think the regime will never change. Some think the regime will change tomorrow. Kind of hard to say. Attacking them would certainly turn them against us. But if we did attack them, we would only do it, and we may need to do it, if they do acquire weapons of mass destruction, then they might certainly use them against the United States. And when I say, by the way, those people, look at Iran. In Iran, Mr. Ahmadinejad speaks to the ghost of the 12th Imam in a well every day. He believes the ghost will return in the event of a worldwide cataclysm. He's building nuclear weapons. He's enriching uranium that he'll convert to plutonium. He's building the Shahab-3 missile. When he fought the war with Iraq, or when Iran fought the war with Iraq, they had waves of women and children clearing out minefields. These people have different standards of right and wrong and morality than we do. And again, not to, you know, I don't say it in either a racist way or a bigoted way. I mean to say they're their people. They'll do what they want to do, what's in their interest. We have to do what's in our interest. But these people have a different standard of right and wrong and life than we do.
How can you say that watching the demonstrations that took place in Iran in 2009?
And I see the Iranian government beating those people
Right.
and killing those people.
Right. The people
and,
with a
and the
monopoly
vast
of
majority,
force. Yeah.
the vast majority of the people stayed in. They stayed indoors. They're not going to risk it.
Because you're dealing with a monopoly of force exercised by a few to control what's happening in society. Some
The
brave
average
people
Iranian
standing
middle
up to protest that, and that some brave people standing up to protest that, and many others afraid. And you know, if you do, yeah, and there are opinion polls that have been done in Iran looking at the views of Iranians. They are very anti-regime, very pro-Western in the sense of wanting to get out of that and build something different. So
the Iranian middle class is making a lot of money. There's a wealthy class there. They have very little interest in the regime changing at the top. The vast majority of people are certainly unhappy with the dictatorship of the mullahs, but they have they've, other than the uprisings a few years ago, they haven't really signaled that they're willing to change things.
Can I just jump in on this real quick?
Go ahead.
Because look, there's a lot of literature about what causes countries to become liberal democracy, and I'm not going to say what it all says, but it has to do with the institutions, the underlying institutions in the country, civil society, things of that nature. And one of the reasons we were successful in Germany and Japan is they had a lot of that stuff, and a lot of bad ideas too, but they had a bureaucracy, they had a civil society, they had political scientists would tell you the preconditions that are likely to cause liberalism. And I agree that most of these countries in the Middle East don't. But it's not really because of Islam, but because of these other things, in my opinion. And then just quickly on Iran, look, I mean, obviously it's a complicated place with a lot of different factions. I don't think you say, you know, the leader wants this or that. Obviously there's different factions who probably want different things. And I think they're pursuing nuclear weapons, sure, but there's elements there that probably don't want to do that. And the question is, how do you affect that, the internal politics? And I think the first thing to keep in mind when doing that is we're not very popular there. You know, we have to sort of almost do things that the opposite of what we want to do, because people are likely to turn against whatever we ask for. And I would just say finally, you know, if everybody has seen Red Dawn, you know, they have the sequel to the movie Red Dawn coming out, and you know, the Russian occupiers come into the country, and it's just automatic that the kids in the high school like Patrick Swayze just go up in the hills and fight back, you know, and that's what nationalism is, and it's this ridiculous movie, but it's a real thing, and Americans, you know, especially in DC, just ignore it. Like, you just expect people to look at us like we look at them, and like we look at ourselves. And I think it's just, it's a little bit cheesy, but you have to be empathetic. People in Pakistan really believe that the United States of America wants to attack them. They're not just kidding around. People in Iran, there's American troops on both the bordering countries. We talk about bombing them a lot in our politics. They're actually scared of being attacked by the United States. All the stuff about the regime being miserable I agree with, but they're also frightened at the same time. I think, would they stop going after the nuclear weapon if we just left them alone? Probably not. But was it a factor in helping them make that decision in the first place? Absolutely, absolutely. So our presence is one of the reasons they pursue weapons. It's the same for North Korea and
so it's
various
our
other
fault?
places.
It's our fault?
I didn't say it was our fault. I'm just, it's how it is. It's not. I'm not talking about right and wrong right now. There's all sorts of bad things. I'm happy to agree with you on about them.
Can I just add briefly? I don't think anyone is advocating a war of liberation in Iran. I mean, I think we're getting a little bit distracted here. I mean, I certainly agree with Kurt. I mean, at most, those of us who have criticized this administration's handling of Iran and the Green Movement is that they just remained silent and did nothing. And at a minimum, those of you who are not always willing to intervene militarily, I would hope that you would agree that the President of the United States of America, the supposed leader of the free world, can actually stand up and say, I'm with the people in the streets who are fighting for the same freedoms that we enjoy here. Sure. And so that's one thing. In the case of Iran, the talk about a military intervention of some sort is almost entirely focused on the threat posed by the nuclear program. Some of us have also written and talked a lot about the fact that people like to ignore the fact that Iran has consistently killed Americans in recent decades, including in Iraq and including in Afghanistan. I think your average American would understand and be angry that the Iranian government has provided training and equipment and weapons to militias in both Iraq and Afghanistan who have been killing our citizens. That is an act of war. It, in my mind, deserves a response. An assassination plot against a foreign official in this city that would have killed innocent Americans is an act of war.
Let's go ahead and have the trial and prove it before we convict them.
You can argue about whether the Justice Department is lying to the American people, but
I want to have a trial. The Justice Department indicted them.
I'm just saying that we're not talking about a war of liberation. We're talking about strategic, hard security interests here when it comes to Iran. And I think there's actually broad consensus in the American public about that. When Ron Paul started to talk about these issues in the debates recently, I think he was basically laughed off the stage, and rightly so. And again, I think these views about Iran, that somehow they're not dangerous, that we don't need to worry about the nuclear weapons program, they're not serious and they're not part of the American mainstream.
Okay. Ilya, right here.
Ilya Shapiro from the Cato Institute, and I don't do foreign policy. I'm a simple constitutional lawyer. And let me tell you, foreign policy is hard. There are no, there's no written constitution that tells you what powers the government has and says the people keep the rest of it. There's no, rights written down, all these different things. We can quote the founders and stuff, but that's not the same thing as being a textualist or originalist. It's very hard to have principles in foreign policy other than, okay, we don't want to just unilaterally surrender, period, and we don't engage in wars of conquest and for Lebensraum and things like this. Well, there's a lot of room in between those 2 points. At that point, it's a prudential thing rather than simply a principle thing. And so, I agree on the framework that my colleague Ben has proposed in terms of you always want to look at the cost benefits of doing a particular thing. Now, I disagree with Ben on the outcome of that cost benefit analysis in certain cases, but really the process is what matters. And it's not a matter of saying, well, they had 28% then, now we have 4%, which is too low, it should be 6%. I mean, defense is practically the only constitutional thing the federal government does. So it's understandable that when the government was more constitutional, they would have a higher percentage doing defense. It's really backwards to set a figure of some sort or say we'll only accept 10% cuts. Maybe 10% cuts is the right answer. Maybe 50 is the right answer. Maybe 0 is right. Maybe increasing the budget is the right answer. But that's, the question you want to ask is the framework of, so we have a problem. We have a problem in Iran. We have a problem with, well, China. Is that a threat? Is it a military threat? Is it an economic threat? And you have to evaluate and on lots of different criteria what thereby your response. It's like with the Soviet Union. Right, so that was the enemy. Does that mean we bomb them? Does that mean we engage in full trade relations? Does that mean we put on sanctions? There's no clear-cut answer. It's a prudential discussion that you have to have based on evaluating what the cost of a particular policy is and what your suspected benefits are. Now, Ben and a lot of my colleagues at Cato don't find as many benefits to certain types of interventions that I wouldn't, and that's fine. That's a reasonable discussion to have. But the framework has to be not just, rah America, we need to be strong, we need to increase military and just be in 8 billion bases around the world as the world's policeman or what have you. I mean, that's overly simplistic. And, a lot of people on various positions are overly simplistic. I think it's counterproductive to call your opponents isolationist or neoconservative or whatever. These are things saying that your foreign policy is one that I don't agree with. And it's, I'm sorry I don't have any solutions for you. In 3 minutes, I wouldn't have any if I was stood here and filibustered for 3 days. But you look at each policy problem that you have, and maybe it's just because I'm a simple constitutional lawyer and it's much easier to deal, again as I said, with telling what powers the government has rather than how they should use this more nebulous power over foreign policy, that lies in the executive. Thanks.
Thanks. All right. Right here.
Hi, my name is William Upton. Couple quick points, I guess. First, on that, similar to a point that Jack made, and kind of rebutting JP a little bit too. There is actually really truly a conservative tradition of, well, not necessarily non-interventionism, strains in isolationism as well, and this dates back to even before World War II. There was the America First Committee head up by John T. Flynn, Garrett Garrett, both prominent conservative journalists, as well as Felix Morley, who was actually one of the founding editors of Human Events, one of Ronald Reagan's favorite newspapers. So just to add that point out there. But more than anything, we've heard today that America has come into countries and lifted them up from the lowly masses, and that it's important for America to stand up and say, to the Green Revolution in Iran, we support you. Well, there's also a historical trend of some of America's interventions abroad that did not end up quite as well. I would point to one. Abraham Lincoln wrote in support of Benito Juarez in Mexico. That revolution ended up with a destabilization of the empire of Maximilian von Habsburg, with him being lined up against the wall and shot and executed, very similar to what we've seen in Libya and in Iraq with the former leadership there. On top of that, Mexico has gone on from that point to undergo a second revolution and 2 failed states. So America's verbal support of Benito Juarez's regime did not end up very much as well. Moving on from that point, we went into World War I, engaged in World War I, and the outcome of World War I, many economists now point to the heavy burden put on Germany leading into World War II. But on top of that, the outcome of World War I stretches even further, and the fact that America could not stand up for some of the European powers, instead let Europe succumb to utter nationalism and carve itself up. The disintegration of the Austro-Hungarian Empire has directly led to the ethnic conflicts we're seeing in the Balkans and southeastern Europe today. It is a direct result of that. Moving on beyond that, we have seen our interventions in Korea. We still have North and South Korea. Our intervention in Vietnam, where old John McCain might say, yay, we should have put more troops in, more troops would have won the war. The fact was the North Vietnamese were going to go to the last man. It was a nationalist idea that we were going up against. And the fact is, that's what we don't understand. We are fighting, when we go into countries like North Vietnam, for instance, we were fighting an ideology. And the problem with the U.S. foreign policy is we have come to let ideology dictate that. This is something that Russell Kirk has warned against. This is something that conservatives in the past, the late Senator Robert Taft has warned against. We have succumbed to ideology. And this goes back to the classics too. Thucydides in the history of the Peloponnesian War warned against ideology and allowing ideology to guide your foreign policy. He elevated the idea of the Spartan foreign policy much higher than that of Athens. Spartan acted in cold national interest, whereas Athens was more prone to an ideological foreign policy, to the idea of movement, to motion, to constant progress. So I would caution that saying that there is no conservative tradition of being opposed to intervention abroad is just historically incorrect. And I would also caution that saying that America has a great track record abroad is also historically incorrect.
Any responses on Pierre before we?
In general, though, we like fighting wars somewhere else than here in North America, right? Let's pick Vietnam for a moment. We fought there because we had a conception back in the 1950s and 60s of the island shield of Asia, that if we were in Vietnam and Korea and Japan and the Philippines, if we were there, the Chinese would have to displace us before they could ever wage war against the United States. Because our first and central objective is to make sure we don't fight wars in North America. Why? Because this is where we live. And so to the extent that we're a commercial republic that goes around the world and trades with people, that's all to the good. To the extent that we can go places and do things that are in our interest. Now, we got Vietnam wrong. We may have gotten parts of World War I wrong. We may get certain things wrong. So on that, you have a lot to say. But the idea that we would rather fight wars somewhere else has always been a very American thing to do. And, you know, the conservative movement, I mean, we can pick people from the conservative movement, but fighting wars somewhere else is a very American thing. And most of the time, if we did it right, and I would even praise President Bush, if he fought Iraq and Afghanistan because he wanted to fight the war there rather than here in North America, that would at least have an interest about it. Again, we may get it wrong, but in general, to the extent that we're fighting somewhere else, I think we're better off.
We promised to end at 9:30, so I think we're going to have to bring it back up and have short closing comments. I will tell you, though, we've been going for 2 hours. I'll tell you, though, that we can't solve these issues now, and this is just the beginning of a conversation we plan to have in the coming months with future events. So, Jamie, closing remarks?
Thanks. Just to address maybe the last comment, I'm not denying that there's a conservative tradition that's perhaps non-interventionist. I mean, but how has that worked out for the conservative movement? Which recent Republican president has embodied that tradition? None of them have. Take that to the country, fine. It's not going to get us anywhere. We can be spending the next several decades sitting in ballrooms like this rather than being in the halls of power actually making policy. So I'm all for people who want to advocate for that policy, but you're not going to convince the American people, and it hasn't convinced the American people in the past. I greatly respect George Will, William F. Buckley, but George Will was for the war in Iraq and Afghanistan before he was against it, and he changed his mind. Now he's allowed to do that, and I understand a lot of people changed their minds who were originally for the wars. But it's not some badge of honor that he always was correct, that this was the wrong thing to do. It's the fatigue that Brian talked about and that I talked about. That certainly happened, mistakes were made, and a lot of people changed their mind along the way, and I understand why that was the case. Briefly on the defense budget, because I really think, I didn't talk about it yet, but it's obviously central to all of these debates because we can't intervene and we can't have a serious national security policy if we can't actually equip and train and deploy the military that we need. Libertarians, people at Cato, whatever they want to call themselves, they don't want to have that strategic debate because the country is not with them. The country does not believe that we should just accept the rise of China and that we have no interest in the Pacific. The country does not believe that we should not care if Iran gets nuclear weapons. The country, the American people are concerned about terrorist attacks against the homeland. And the sort of actual foreign policy that libertarians and many of the people at Cato want to pursue is incredibly dangerous, risky foreign policy, and I think the American people understand that. So instead of actually promoting that strategic debate, they argue things like my colleague to the right, who just says, well, we should just slash because that'll force us to make these choices. That's not a serious way to go about developing a national security strategy.
I just sat here for a half hour and articulated all my ideas about how we ought to change our strategy around, though, before I said that.
Let's have that, because we're not actually having that. We're not actually having that in Washington.
Go read my op-ed everywhere today. I'm doing my very best.
We're talking about top line. We're talking about top line defense cuts. The super committee, if it fails to actually produce results, we're talking about additional $600 billion. There's no strategic debate that's being part of that. Pentagon can't even keep up with the cuts that are coming out of the White House and out of Congress. So I'm all for a strategic debate. Let's actually decide what our priorities are. But the problem is that a lot of people who want to change our foreign policy are just trying to do so by going after the numbers, and I think that's incredibly dangerous. One final point on the Arab Spring. I'm more optimistic than Brian. I understand, though, the concerns, but we need to understand we need to have the long-term perspective, and Brian pointed out how long it took the U.S. to get where we are today. I think in many cases of these countries in the Middle East, Egypt, Libya, hopefully a free Syria, hopefully a free Iran, we may have to wait 100 years, and there are going to be a lot of backward steps along the way that are going to provide very nervous situations for us and for our allies like Israel. I'm ready to go through that. I think that's what we need to do to achieve the results that will be in our long-term security interest. And I think the Arab Spring is happening whether we like it or not, and the question is not always whether we're going to be involved militarily. But if this is unfolding, if there are dangerous trends like the Muslim Brotherhood in some of these countries, so what should we do if we're concerned about it? Just act like we don't think it's actually happening? We should be involved. We should be funding the secular groups that are trying to push back against the extremists. So I think an isolationist policy, or one that believes that we should somehow just turn our back on what's going on, it isn't even realistic, and it's certainly not going to achieve our interests in the long run.
Well, you know, you're resorting to slogans that I already talked about. I mean, I said it's not isolationist to be for free trade, immigration, diplomacy, cultural exchange, and war on occasion when it's necessary, far less than you would like. I mean, you know, that's just not what isolationism was. So it's just reductionist to wind up on a bumper sticker. And, you know, look, a lot of what you're saying contradicts a lot of the other stuff you're saying. You're saying, on the one hand, we are the proud owners of American intellectual and conservative history. We have it all. It's always been thus. It's not serious for anyone to stand up at a Republican debate and say, you know, maybe the Iranian, you know, the world wouldn't be consumed in a ball of flame if Iran got nuclear weapons, since China, communist China and communist Russia got them, and everybody came out more or less okay. And you say, you know, this is, America will never accept this point of view. And then you're saying it's a terrible risk to the conservatives that isolationists are rising. Which is it? You know, you can go say the isolationists are wrong. I wouldn't use that word. You know, you guys are wrong. Let's have a debate about who's right and who's wrong. Or you can choose the argument that it's just inevitable that they'll be ignored by history. But those two things badly contradict each other. And I think you ought to go with the one where you actually stick to the facts. We invited, when we had a debate at Cato, like in the spring, about U.S. foreign policy and defense spending, we invited 2 guys from AEI to come and speak at Cato, and we couldn't even get people to email us back. I got the sense they didn't want to come debate us about strategy. I mean, I'm wasting half my time arguing with no one about how we could have a different kind of defense strategy, and you're saying you're not talking about defense strategy, you just want to cut. I mean, I said, look, we're going to have the debate when we cut. I did say that, but give me a break, man. You know, go look at what's on my website. I mean, half my life is devoted to doing this. The point was raised before, the very articulate remarks by the gentleman to my left about everything you said. I mostly agreed with, except ideology is unescapable. I mean, you got to have an ideology. Ideologies are just ways that we interpret facts as they come at us in the world. And we ought to think about what would make us change our ideology, what set of facts would cause us to reconsider things. But it's unescapable that you ought to have, that you have one. Lindsey Graham says he wants to save a bunch of money by being more efficient in the Pentagon. I think the way you save a bunch of money in the Pentagon is by doing less. The waste, fraud, and abuse in the Pentagon is really not very much money. If you want to save big bucks, you got to make some choices about what we're doing with the forces. It's a phony argument to say we're going to get everything, even $400 billion, which, by the way, is measured against the rate of increase. It's not that defense spending is actually going down, but even $400 billion over 10 years, you're not going to get that by efficiency. You got to make some choices. Which reminds me, you know, we have not cut the defense budget if you measure it against current spending, inflation included. The United States Senate is about to cut a deal with the House on the bottom line for defense, $518 billion, not including the wars, which is higher, adjusting for inflation, than last year. We spend more than we did at any point during the Cold War on defense. It's a lot less of GDP because we got way, way, way richer, 7 times richer than we were in 1950. The founding fathers, yeah, they spent more on defense back then because as a percentage of the budget, because A, as I noted, the budget was really small, and B, they had a lot of security problems. The European powers were in North America threatening us. There was a fire in 1812 in Washington, D.C. when the British came here. I mean, they had real big defense problems, very different than what we have today. So I'll just sort of leave it there, and just as a final note, you know, you're saying, oh, you guys are, it's a risky, terrible defense policy. Look, there are risks on both sides. I mean, my whole argument is that it's more risky and worse for the national interest to do what you're saying. So let's just acknowledge that we have a difference of opinion about where the risks lie and try to evaluate them, rather than saying you guys are just a bunch of nutballs, you accept risk. Our preferences about politics are basically arguments about which risk to accept and which to just deal with. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Brian.
There are people, we're sitting in this room tonight debating American foreign policy. I guarantee you there are people sitting in rooms in China and Russia figuring out how do you put the Chinese in China or the Russians on top? How do we make us the premier power in the world? They're trying to figure that out. And they spend immense resources to make that happen. We in this country, I won't say we're quibbling about the defense budget, because it's a lot of money. But what ultimately is the right amount to spend? I hear these debates in Washington where people say, we should spend 4%. No, we should spend 4.3 or 5 or 6. What is the right number to spend? The number might be 100% if we thought that our national freedom was at stake. And so, agreeing with Jamie, we have to look at this from the point of view of strategy. If we have enemies who seek our destruction, what does it take to make sure they are discouraged from doing so? Today, I do not believe we are doing that. We're not doing that when it comes to our nuclear weapons, when it comes to missile defense, the potency of our Army, our Navy, or our Air Force. We are simply not spending enough to compete in the world. Now, people who are budget hawks hate to hear those kind of things. But when you look at the Chinese and the Russians, and the Chinese and the Russians are helping the Iranians, they've been helping sponsor bad things all over everywhere the Americans want to be, that we have to compete. Now, we have to get better at it. We have to spend the money that you know, we can afford to, but we can find it if we need to. And I think that's a high priority. The final thing is, it seems to me, based on that, we have to have a new strategy that gets us out of the business of thinking that democracy in the Middle East, to press on this point one more time, that democracy has to be the only method for getting the countries in the Middle East on a different path. I believe we did not discourage the cause of radical Islam after September 11th. We may have set them back, but today they are arming and they are emboldened. And the fact that we didn't go after Iran when we knew the Iranians were killing Americans in Iraq sent a message to Iran that you can kill Americans with relative impunity. And the fact that we didn't do that because we got our priorities, in my opinion, wrong, sends the wrong message. So we need to reconstitute our foreign policy based on whatever it takes to make sure we're defended and that we can defend the Constitution. Thanks.
Thanks. There's a lot to agree with in this last round. It's a good last round. I want to start by thanking Marion and the Society for putting this together. It is a very valuable civic service to have this kind of discussion, and I hope you do it not only in DC, but other places in the country. Very important. Second, I'm just going to touch on a couple things that people have said in kind of rapid fire way just to bring them up again. One of them, if I understood Mr. Shirazi's point correctly, the United States is popular in Iran. Invading Iran would not be popular. That's an important point. I wanted to bring that up again. Second, maybe I'm in the wrong room because I really don't care about the labels. Conservative, libertarian, you know, which is the real conservative? I don't care. I don't even understand the differences sometimes. What I'm interested in is really looking at the choices that we have to make. And this is, everyone in this last round has said this. It's about strategy and about choices. Where's the cost of what you want to do? Where's the benefit of what you want to do? That, I think, is right. A lot of examples of history have come up, and I would just make a point about history. It's important to know your history and to learn from history because you can see what other people have done, but history is never determinative. Things happen, things are unique, leadership matters, ideas matter, circumstances matter, so you need to learn, but you can't then take that as therefore this. It's just part of the background. I would say, however, something that I do think is relevant and transformative is the idea of human freedom and the ability of people to get control of their governments rather than the other way around. I think that has been a transformative idea in history, and from the point that that has begun, which you could really date in modern times to, again, I think someone mentioned the Magna Carta, that has taken off, and even despite all of the ups and downs that we've had over centuries, there are more people living in free societies today and better off for it than have ever been the case before. So that is a transformative idea, probably one thing you can pull out of history and take to heart. I agree, however, with Brian's point about the way superpowers act. You know, China and Russia, that's exactly right. And that is a small group of people in a non-democratic system who are making calculated sets of interest. I agree with that. And I also agree that the extremists mean what they say. They do want to kill us. But I don't believe that the vast majority of people around the world that we have to deal with, including in Islam, are extremists. And so we need to distinguish between them. And in fact, I would go further. You would disagree with this. I think that the revolutions in the Arab world that we're seeing now have done more to undermine the extremist narrative and cause than anything else that we've seen in the last 10 years. And I think in doing so, you know, they are sort of vindicating in a way the way that we did take on the violent extremists by going after them and trying to kill them, while at the same time not taking on Islam as a whole. So I think that is actually a very hopeful sign that we see. I wanted to comment on the gentleman here from South Carolina. I've heard the same thing from soldiers as well. I've heard what the gentleman in front of you said, that there are great people there and they're the bravest people we've met and they are trying to build a society. And I've heard the exact opposite, saying we go in and we're trying to build an economy and they're sitting there leaning on their shovels watching, wondering, you know, what are these guys up to? So I've heard both. But there is enough out there, especially in the last year or so, if you can take control of the security environment so that, you know, people are not afraid of the Taliban coming and knocking on the door at night, or you're not having this, you know, by daytime it's us, by nighttime it's the Taliban, but you're actually creating enough security for a long enough period of time that people have confidence, things do take off. And I think that's what the surge demonstrated in Iraq and is demonstrating in Afghanistan. The problem is that it takes time for institutions and interests to settle in so that becomes sustainable. And, you know, to try to run this by a deadline is not realistic. That's not making a substantive choice, but a time-limited choice. And it's also ignorant of resources. As I said in my opening, I don't think we have the money to have a surge-level capacity in Afghanistan for the next 10 years or 20 years. So I think it gets back to what everyone has said. You got to make choices about what you want to do. And finally, since I was ambassador to NATO, I just have to make a quick point about the NATO budgets. NATO countries spend money on themselves. So we put our money into our defense forces, France puts it into defense forces, Germany and so on. The actual common NATO budgets are tiny, because it's really what the countries bring to the table. And the US has only 20% of the common NATO budgets. But when people talk about NATO not pulling its share, what they're talking about is that we're putting in 4.5%, 5% of GDP into defense of a massive GDP, and others are putting in 1% or less of smaller GDPs. So they're dramatically eroding their own national defense capabilities, so not much can be done by NATO countries without the US. So the problem of the free riders there, but it's not that we're paying an undue share of the budget, it's just that we've made choices about our defense establishment based on our own interests and our own needs, and they have made different choices which have left us with a hollowed out NATO in Europe.
Great. Thank you all for joining us in this very important conversation tonight. Like I said, in the coming months we'll have future debates, probably more formal debates on other topics, and follow us on Facebook or find us on Twitter, or is that the other way around? Or visit our website the old-fashioned way and sign up for our future invitations. Please join me in thanking our panelists. Good night.